This video is going to be soft spoken. And let me know if this quality is okay, because I'm not 100% sure what's too loud, what's too quiet. Just let me know. So, today we're going to be doing another ASMR true crime. Now, this is my third time filming this. I'm a little irritated with my devices. The file has corrupted twice, and I don't want that to happen again. So if it feels like I'm rushing through this, I'm really sorry. I'm going to try not to, but it's just been really frustrating. So, but today we are going to be covering the case of Sherri Rasmussen. And even though I'm under a lot of pressure because my files keep corrupting, I'm still going to do everything I can to make this as detailed and as thorough as possible, so do not fret. But yeah, we're just going to get right into the case of Sherri Rasmussen. So, if you saw my case about Mo Wilson, this is very similar, but happened about 30 years prior. So, more than that, honestly, 35. So, let's just get right into it. So, Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7th, 1957 in Walla Walla, Washington. However, she was raised in Tucson, Arizona with her siblings, and her father was a dentist, and her mother was actually the manager of the dentist office that he worked at. She was described as someone who was very caring. She really put others first, always very selfless, and very smart, incredibly intelligent. She had both beauty and brains. She was 6'1". She was this beautiful, tall blonde. And she graduated from high school at the age of 16, which is just so incredible. What an accomplishment. And that's when she started college at Loma Linda University in California, where she majored in nursing, and she specifically wanted to go into critical care. And after doing that, after graduating, she got her master's degree at UCLA at the age of 23, also in nursing. And by her late 20s, she was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, which is such an accomplishment. I'm sure everyone around her, her friends and her family were so incredibly proud of her, and I'm sure she was proud of herself. At such a young age, I think she was 27. That is such an accomplishment to have. And in this position, she was tasked with giving presentations and teaching classes for other nurses who were currently studying and or new to the hospital. And during that time of her life, during those first, 27-ish years, she never really put love or relationships super high on her priorities. She was very focused on her career and her education. That was until by a chance she went to a party with a friend in 1984, and she met John Rutten. John Rutten was a UCLA mechanical engineering major who had graduated just in the past few years. He's a little bit younger than Sherri, and he was from San Diego, and they immediately hit it off. That night, Sherri invited him to her apartment the next night, and she made him dinner, and it was kind of one of those love at first sight things. They were just clicking really well, and it kind of moved very quickly from there. So quickly that within the year of dating, they were engaged and married. So things moved incredibly fast for them. But unfortunately, this is a true crime, so the story does not end with their happily ever after, because there's always someone else in these situations that is not making their presence known at the very moment, but will now. So, there was a woman that John had kept hanging on for several years, and her name was Stephanie Lazarus. So Stephanie Lazarus was from Simi Valley, California. She was born in 1960, and she and John met because they lived in the same residence hall at UCLA. They had met at a party, similarly to Sherri and John, and they had bonded about their love for fitness and all things health related. Stephanie was a member of the UCLA women's junior varsity basketball team, and they just really bonded over their love for fitness. And she was a political science major at UCLA. And like I said, John was a mechanical engineering major. They were around the same age. I think John might have been a year or two older. And they developed a very interesting relationship, a sort of friends of benefits relationship of sorts. Stephanie would steal John's clothes when he was showering and would also take photographs of him while he was sleeping, which is what some of the sources I read said, which is so bizarre. But that was, I guess, the kind of relationship they had. And they never really were like intimate in any way. They were just kind of like kissing, cuddling, all that stuff. That was until John graduated from UCLA in 1981. They were intimate, but they were never a couple. John was very clear that he was not interested in that at all. Even though he was taking her on family vacations, they were spending a lot of time together. She was really getting to know his family and his friends. They were never an official couple, and he did not see her as his girlfriend, but the same cannot be said for Stephanie. So, in 1983, Stephanie applied and was accepted into the police academy for the LAPD. When Stephanie threw John, and they were still continuing like their friends with benefits sort of relationship during this time. But everything kind of hit a turning point in 1984, which is when obviously Sherri and John met. This is when Stephanie threw John a surprise party for his 25th birthday. During this time, Stephanie really only thought she was the only woman in John's life. She didn't know that he was seeing other women, let alone that he was developing serious feelings for Sherri Rasmussen. But it was at this party that she learned that she was not the only woman in John's life. He had been with several other women, but that he was in this very serious relationship with Sherri Rasmussen. And this completely broke Stephanie. She was completely distraught. She would write about her inner journal about how she didn't want to work, she didn't want to do anything. She was even writing letters to John's mother. Now, like I said, they had developed a relationship of sorts, so it wasn't that unusual. But it was getting to a point where she was kind of writing to his mom, I miss John, I want to be with John, yada yada yada. Just things you wouldn't say to, a ex-situationship's parent, I guess. So, and then shortly after finding out that, Sherri and John were in this serious relationship, it was found out that they were engaged, and this completely tore Stephanie apart even more. And like I said, she was just writing in her journal about how she was convinced that she would never find anyone like John and that he was the one for her. And, she's allowed to feel upset. She was kind of led on by this guy, but at the same time, he was very clear with his intentions, but I do empathize with her a little bit there. So, shortly after finding out that they were engaged, Stephanie decided that she needed closure. So she went to see John, and she was like, look, I need some closure. How about we're just intimate one more time, and that's it. That's all I need. While he was engaged to Sherri. And John agreed. He was intimate with Sherri. Or Stephanie. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He was intimate with Stephanie while he was engaged to Sherri. So sleazy. So, Sherri found out about this affair before their wedding, and she wanted to end it with John, but he was like, no, this is never happen again. This is this is a one-time thing. Like, you're the only woman I want, basically. And she listened. I mean, she trusted him. She wanted to be with him. Another time during their engagement, Stephanie had brought over her skis to John and Sherri's condo, because at this time they were living together. And she had asked John to wax them, which didn't really seem like a pressing matter. And not only did she do this, but she also came over in like super form-fitting clothing, and really just to like intimidate and make Sherri feel insecure, I think. And after this, Sherri was like, are you 100% positive that your relationship with Stephanie is over? Like, is this over? Are there no feelings there? Because she was feeling really insecure for the right reason. And John was like, absolutely no feelings there. You know, she is just a friend, basically. But Stephanie came back to get her skis a few days later, and John was not home, but Sherri was, and Stephanie greeted her in her complete LAPD uniform, equipped, you know, with a gun and everything, really just to intimidate her more, to like remind her that she was like in this position of power. It seemed like a deliberate attempt. So then Sherri had reported to her dad that Stephanie was scaring her on multiple occasions. On one occasion, Stephanie visited Sherri at her job and was wearing revealing clothing. And according to Sherri's dad, said to Sherri, if I can't have him, nobody can, is what Stephanie said to Sherri while she was at work, wearing these like super provocative clothes so that she could show off her body, because she was in great shape. I mean, she was an athlete. But that really freaked her out, and that made her super nervous for the right reason. And she had also claimed that Stephanie was stalking her on the street. Like, she would like look around and Stephanie would just be there. But even when bringing this up to John, he just kind of brushed it off and didn't say anything to Stephanie. And she begged him to not let Stephanie come to their home again and to tell her to leave them alone, but he never did. And Sherri and John married in November of 1985. But we already know the kind of person that Stephanie Lazarus seems to be. So her words, if I can't have him, nobody can, were a very serious threat to Sherri and her life. So, on the morning of February 27th, 1986, John left for work, as usual. That morning, Sherri was scheduled to give a motivational speech at work, but she didn't really like this tactic of like trying to like, you know, boost morale or whatever. So John kind of assumed that maybe she would call in sick that day, you know, so she didn't have to do it. And that was kind of his assumption. At 9:45 a.m., a neighbor noticed that their garage door was open, but there was no car visible, which they thought was really unusual. They never had their garage open, especially not with a car in it, at least, you know, just to show that somebody was home. But it appeared nobody was home. The garage was just left open. During the day, John had called multiple times and the calls went unanswered. But like I said, he kind of just assumed maybe she was taking the day easy, taking it off. It was the 80s. It wasn't that unusual for people not to answer their phones as much. And even Sherri's sister was calling, but she also was not getting any replies. And at noon, two men who were believed to be gardeners gave the Rettons neighbors, the same ones that saw the garage open, a purse. And this purse ended up belonging to Sherri. So, when John came home, he found his garage open, like it had been all day, and broken glass in the driveway. And obviously, that raised several concerns, but more than anything, the BMW that he had bought Sherri as an anniversary gift was gone. The car was gone, nowhere to be found. So he was obviously very frightened and taken aback by this. But obviously, he had to enter the house to investigate what had happened. And when he did, he had found Sherri dead on the living room floor with 3 shots, 3 bullet holes. There were obvious signs of struggle. There had been a vase broken over her head prior to her death, and a bloody handprint next to the burglar's panic alarm, basically insinuating that she was trying to use that to get help, which is so tragic and just horrific to think about. There was also a bruise on her face that appeared to have been inflicted by the muzzle of a gun, and she had several defensive wounds, so she really did fight for her life. And in addition to this, the gun was fired through a quilted blanket, and this was to muffle the sound because this murder was committed in broad daylight in the early morning, like 8 o'clock, they think. So, yeah, and the only piece of DNA they were able to collect was from a bite mark on Sherri's arm. But you will see that this bite mark does not get investigated for nearly 20 years later. So, onto the investigation. The LAPD, who was investigating the case, quickly determined that Sherri had been killed by a burglar. They said that the perpetrator had been in the process of stealing electronics because there was like wires cut, things were out of place electronically, things were out of place. And Sherri had surprised them, and they killed her because, they didn't want her to report them or anything. So that's why there was jewelry left behind, and the car was taken as a getaway vehicle. So that was their rationale. However, the BMW was recovered a week later. You'd think if a burglar was trying to steal something from someone, they would sell a BMW, a really nice car. But it was just found abandoned. And there was no new evidence because with this car being found. And the only other thing that had been stolen from the Ruttons' home, this makes me so annoyed that it took them so long to solve, was John and Sherri's marriage certificate. That was the only other thing that had been stolen, and it was never recovered. So John Rutton was quickly ruled out as a suspect because he was at work, he had a strong alibi, and he was just completely distraught over this. And Sherri's parents urged the investigator to look into Stephanie Lazarus because of what their daughter had told them about their, the harassment that she had been experiencing. And they said, okay, yeah, we'll make a note of it, no worry. But remember, Stephanie Lazarus is in the LAPD, and the LAPD is infamous for protecting their own. But the police just kind of walked away from the case, said it was a burglary, and that Sherri was killed with a .38 caliber. And the case went completely cold. John moved to Los Angeles, and him and Stephanie actually reconnected for a while. And one of the craziest things about the case is that when him and Stephanie were in a period of where they were reconnecting, he had called the investigator on Sherri's case and been like, hey, there's no way that Stephanie is involved in the murder of my wife, right? This is alleged, but it's and then they were like, oh no, yeah, definitely not. And Stephanie and John were intimate during this period of time where they were reconnecting. But yeah, that's just so insane, I think. But during this time, the Rasmussen family offered cash rewards, any information leading to the discovery of Sherri's murderer, but nothing came from it. And after, the late 80s, John and Stephanie fell out of touch, And Stephanie actually started her own family. She got married to another LAPD officer, adopted a daughter, and really started to rise the ranks in the LAPD. She went on to start her own private investigation firm, and she won a ton of medals for her performance as an officer. So, now we're in like the late 90s, early 2000s, and DNA technology is becoming a lot more advanced. And because of this, the LAPD created a cold case unit to investigate these old cases that have been unsolved for so many years. So, in 2004, nearly 20 years after the murder of Sherri, Jennifer Francis, a forensic pathologist, was able to analyze DNA from Sherri's case, but not without jumping through like a million hoops. So the key piece of evidence from this case was the bite mark, the DNA from the bite mark they were able to get. But in order to get this DNA, Jennifer had to dig through so many freezers, and in the way back in one of the freezers in the lab, she found the DNA from Sherri's murder, but it was she had to really search for it. It was almost like they were deliberately hiding it, but it was also really old, so that can also be used as an excuse. And there was no match for the DNA, no database connection, but she was able to determine that it was a woman's DNA. So Jennifer started reviewing the case file, and she found a few women that Sherri had altercations with, specifically a woman that she worked with at the hospital. And when contacting the detective supervising her, she started asking questions about a specific woman and didn't really give too much detail. But the detective said, without even really knowing what she was talking about, said, the LAPD detective, referring to Stephanie, she's not a part of this, and insisted it was a burglary. But Jennifer was not referring to the LAPD detective. She had no idea what he was talking about. She was referring to the person that Sherri worked with. But this evidence was further pushed back, and it went cold again. The case, had this glimmer of hope, but nothing happened. Until 2009, the LAPD again began looking into cold cases, and detectives Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba thought Sherri's case was worth pursuing. And they immediately looked at the case as a murder, which is 1,200 steps above, the LAPD in the 80s. They thought it was staged to be a burglary, but it was committed in broad daylight, which is incredibly unusual for burglaries. And the place where John and Sherri lived was in a gated community, so you'd probably have to know someone there, especially if you committed this crime in broad daylight. So Detective Nuttall called John to question him about the case, and he was taken aback by the fact that somebody who was a great threat in John and Sherri's relationship was Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer. And they had no idea about this because you know how the detective back in the 80s, right after Sherri had been murdered, promised her parents that he would write down that information about Stephanie and, put it on the file? He never did. So these detectives didn't even know. And they were so unnerved by that, obviously. At the time, Stephanie was an incredibly well-respected art theft officer. She worked with the commercial crimes division, and she was known for making chocolates and soaps for her neighbors and her co-workers. She was a really well-respected middle-aged woman, and she was eventually ranked in the top 5 suspects in this case because of what John had told them, and then they had talked to Sherri's parents, and furthermore, their ears were perked about Stephanie Lazarus. So over time, all the other women were eliminated, specifically the co-worker that Sherri had issues with. They collected her DNA, and it wasn't a match to the crime. So this really left Stephanie Lazarus as the prime suspect. And as her being the prime suspect, because she was a member of the LAPD, and so was her husband, very well respected members of the LAPD, the investigation was kept completely silent, except for those working directly on it, and she had to be referred to only as number 5. Like, they never said her initials, anything that would put the case at risk of getting exposed. So they began looking into Stephanie's life in the 80s, and they had discovered that she had carried a .38 caliber as her off-duty gun, and that she had reported it stolen 13 days after Sherri's murder. Convenient. But she didn't report it stolen to the LAPD, the police department she worked for. She reported it to the Santa Monica police department. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And records also showed that she was off work for a couple days, including the day that Sherri was murdered. So, like I said, Detective Nuttall had also made contact with Nels, who is Sherri's father, and they had found out that none of this repeated harassment that they had said that Sherri had been receiving from Stephanie was at any point noted on her file. So, in order to really pin this down definitely, with this DNA they had, they needed to get Stephanie's DNA. So, while off duty, Stephanie got a pizza and a soda with her daughter at a Costco. And there were private detectives, private undercover cops there in secret. And as soon as she left, they went to the trash, dug out her cup, and took it back to the lab, where they took the DNA from her cup and the DNA from the bite mark found on Sherri and compared the two. And it was an exact match. So, at this point, they're like, we got her. But how do we get her? That's the thing, because she is a LAPD detective, super well respected, like I've said a million times. So, the homicide detective supervisor at Van Nuys began letting his senior officers and prosecutors know of the case, and they decided that in June of 2009, detectives from the robbery homicide division would interrogate Stephanie due to their lack of personal connection, unlike those in the LAPD, because, they needed to have someone who didn't really know Stephanie, because these detectives worked, the ones like Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba worked literally right across the hall from her pretty much. So they needed people that were not directly anywhere near it. In addition to this, Police Chief William Bratton ordered that the interview be held at the lockup at Parker Center, so that Stephanie would have to surrender her gun. And basically what the lockup is, it's just like a place where you interrogate people, but you're not allowed to have any weaponry because, that's just kind of how it goes. It's a prison like that, but in that sense, like that includes officers, everybody, because that's for protection. And because this is such a violent crime, obviously they're worried that she's going to retaliate in a violent way, even if she doesn't have any other violent record. This is a murder case, so the chief of the police chief wanted to make sure that she did not have any weaponry on her in fear that she would retaliate. So, detectives Greg Starn and Jan Jaramillo summoned Stephanie down to tell her about somebody who was in custody who wanted to talk about an art theft. That was like their ruse that they pulled on her in order to, get her to talk about the case. So they brought her down, kind of, framed it up to be this way, and they were kind of like, well, we actually want to talk to you about John Rutten. And John Rutten, obviously, she was like, oh yeah, I know John Rutten. And they wanted to do it privately and not at her desk because they didn't want to embarrass her in front of her coworkers. And she was like, okay, that makes sense. And they just wanted to clarify some things about the Rasmussen case. And she was like, yeah, I dated John in college and I haven't seen him in years, but I'm not even sure if I met his wife. And they started confronting her about well, did you have any issues with her? Because people were saying that you had issues with her. She was like, what? No, I'm not even sure if I ever met her. So she became very defensive over time, much more defensive by the minute. And she was like, I feel like I'm being accused of something and I cannot continue with this interview. And at the end, the detectives asked her, okay, like, well, we have this DNA from the case or from the crime scene. Would you be willing to give us your DNA, so we can rule you out? And she was like, no, I need to talk to an attorney. And they were like, okay, yeah, you're free to go. But she was not free to go. As soon as she tried to leave, they arrested her for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen because they already had her DNA. They didn't even need it from her. They were just, this was a ruse to get her to come down here, and if she confessed, great. If not, that's fine, because they have her DNA at the murder scene. So then she was put in jail, obviously, and she was held on a $10 million bond, and she was allowed to retire early from the LAPD, which I think is such crap, because, like, she should be fired, dishonorably. This feels like a very honorable way, oh, she's retiring early. No, she is on trial for murder, and she allegedly at the time, but she murdered somebody while she was working as an officer for the LAPD. But like I said, LAPD infamous for protecting their own. So the trial began in early 2012, and the defense didn't really have an argument, really. I mean, it's kind of hard to fake DNA, but they, tried to say, oh, well, there was a hole in the tube from the DNA, and there were bloody fingerprints at the crime scene, on a record player or something, that were not analyzed. But, there's really no one to blame for that except for the LAPD, who did this in the 80s. But DNA doesn't really lie. So how else would have Stephanie Lazarus' DNA gotten Sherri Rasmussen? There isn't really anyway. So after several days of deliberations with the jury, and obviously the prosecution was like, the DNA, and also the endless harassment that Sherri had been receiving from Stephanie over several months, that many people could attest to. So after several days of deliberations, Stephanie was convicted of first-degree murder in March of 2012, 26 years after Sherri's death. In that same month, she was sentenced to 7 years to life in prison, and she is currently serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Corona, California, and she will be eligible for parole in December of 2034, when she will be 74 years old. She appealed her sentence in 2013, but it was rejected in 2015. But the grass is green for Stephanie Lazarus, unfortunately. In November of 2023, just a few months ago, the parole board in California said that she is eligible for parole and could be free soon, which I think is such a slap in the face to Sherri's family and her loved ones, because this woman has been sitting in prison for this crime for not even 15 years, while she got to live free after committing this crime for 23 years. Wow. Sherri's family was mourning and couldn't have full closure because they didn't know what had happened to their loved one. She had 23 years to be free and to do whatever she wanted after murdering an innocent, beautiful, amazing young woman who had such a bright future ahead of her. And they're thinking that after serving, technically sentenced, she was sentenced 27 years and she's only so far served not even 12. I think that's a bunch of crap, personally. So, let me know what you guys think. But I'm going to end with a quote from Sherri's niece after I was reading an article about how Sherri's family had gone to the parole hearing for Stephanie. And her niece, Jessica Panel, said that Stephanie had 23 years to lie, to hide the evidence and go on with her life, when she could have just turned herself in. And I couldn't agree more. she had 23 years to do all of this, but she's gonna get out possibly after only serving not even 15 in prison. And that, my friends, is the case of Sherri Rasmussen. And my heart just really goes out to her family and her friends, because this case is so infuriating and so agitating, because I don't think justice was served here. And especially if Stephanie gets out, justice will not be served. This case could have been solved in 30 minutes, probably. As soon as they found out that marriage license was stolen. I feel like that is a flaming red flag. But no, it did not get solved in 25 minutes. It took about 25 years for this case to get solved. But yeah, so that case is just absolutely frustrating, and I hope that Sherri or Stephanie, oh my gosh, I keep messing up their names, Stephanie does not get out. Personally, this is a heinous crime, and she has since admitted to it, but she's like, oh, I'm remorseful. But I think a lot of her, special privileges is due to the fact that she was in the LAPD. I really do. And I forgot to mention, but she got like 1,000+ days time served for good behavior when she was sentenced in 2012 for the murder, which is like over 3 years. So there's a bunch of crap, I think. But that is the case of Sherri Rasmussen. I hope you guys enjoyed. And if you enjoyed, be sure to hit the subscribe button. That would mean a lot. And hit the like button as well if you liked it. And if you have any case suggestions for me, leave them in the comments below. I will make sure to do them. And I think that's it for me today. But I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next one. Sleepyhead. Sleepyhead.